Montreal, winter 1969. Snow fell softly on a city dreaming in French and English, its skyline dotted with cranes, its streets alive with ambition. Canada was changing, young, proud, confident. And Montreal wanted to show the world that it was more than maple leaves and politeness. It wanted to prove that it could host the greatest spectacle on earth. The Olympics. For the people of Quebec, it was more than sport. It was a declaration. A declaration that French-speaking Canada could stand tall beside Paris, London, and Tokyo. That it could rise from centuries of being the other, and claim the world's attention with brilliance and grace. In that spirit of pride, the mayor of Montreal, Jean Drapeau, announced his vision. The Olympics will cost no more than $310 million, and not a single taxpayer will pay a cent. The crowd applauded. The press wrote in gold letters. No one could see the storm behind the smile. Drapeau was a dreamer, a man of vision and vanity in equal measure. He had already transformed Montreal with Expo 67, a futuristic world fair that dazzled millions. Now he wanted something even greater, something eternal. He wanted to build a stadium that would make the Roman Colosseum look modest. A tower that would lean like a sculpture. A monument to Canada's future. And so, in 1970, Montreal was officially awarded the XXI Olympiad. Fireworks erupted over the St. Lawrence River. Bands played, people cheered, and the newspapers called it the dawn of a new era. But dawn is deceptive. It hides the darkness waiting underneath. At first, the city moved with energy. Architects debated bold designs. Engineers drew impossible curves. The chosen visionary was Roger Taillibert, a French architect known for sculptural, organic forms. His concept, a retractable roof supported by a 175-meter inclined tower, something no one had ever built. To the politicians it was genius. To the builders it was madness. Construction began in 1973 on frozen ground. Workers battled the elements, machines froze, steel warped, costs crept higher. But Drapeau dismissed the warnings. He spoke of destiny, of progress, of beauty. When journalists questioned the budget, he smiled and said, "The Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby." The quote would become infamous. Behind the rhetoric, cracks appeared, not in concrete but in trust. Suppliers demanded more money. Unions struck for better pay. Every month, deadlines slipped, and with them millions of dollars vanished into bureaucracy and blame. Still the mayor pressed on. He wanted the games to be perfect, the stadium gleaming, the city reborn. To him, perfection was worth any price. By 1975, the price had already tripled. And the stadium, that magnificent tower of dreams, was still unfinished. Winter returned, cruel and heavy. Snow filled the half-built structure, and workers huddled in cold silence, wondering if the roof would ever rise. The International Olympic Committee grew nervous. The world was watching. Montreal had promised a show. Instead, it had delivered a construction site. Then, with barely a year to go, Drapeau doubled down. He summoned crews day and night. He brought in more equipment, more workers, more promises. The city became a factory of panic. Local newspapers began to turn. Headlines read, "A dream turning to debt." Cartoonists drew Drapeau juggling gold coins while the stadium collapsed behind him. But pride is louder than reason. Drapeau insisted, "The Olympics will open on time." He was right. They would. But the cost of that triumph would haunt Montreal for decades. By spring 1976, the streets buzzed with contradiction, excitement and exhaustion, hope and anger. Trucks roared through the city carrying steel beams and banners. Workers painted walls as cameras tested their lenses. The smell of fresh asphalt mixed with the echo of protest chants. Ordinary Montrealers began to ask questions they hadn't before. Why were taxes rising? Why were schools short on funds? Why did no one know how much this dream actually cost? In cafes and living rooms, whispers turned into laughter, laughter into resentment. They called the stadium the Big O, for its shape, for Olympic. Soon they began calling it the Big O. As July 1976 approached, the city held its breath. The stadium still lacked its roof. Equipment failed, payments stalled, deadlines vanished. Then, somehow, miraculously, it happened. On July 17, 1976, the Olympic flame was lit in Montreal. Drums rolled, fireworks burst, and for a moment the world forgot the chaos behind the curtain. Athletes marched in perfect formation, flags waved under a bright summer sky. The tower loomed half-finished, its cables dangling like veins. But no one wanted to see imperfection. They wanted to believe in glory. And for 16 days they did. Inside the stadium, cheers drowned out the whispers of death. Spectators stood in awe as a 14-year-old Romanian gymnast named Nadia Comaneci achieved the first perfect 10 in Olympic history. Her name echoed through Montreal like a prayer, proof that something beautiful could still rise from the chaos. Yet even as the crowds roared, accountants worked late in dark offices, staring at numbers that no longer made sense. Every event, every medal, every moment of wonder was paid for with borrowed money. By the time the flame was extinguished, Montreal owed more than any city in Olympic history. The dream had come true, and left a bill no one could pay. That was only the beginning. The games were over. The debt had just begun. When the cheers faded and the flame went dark, Montreal woke to silence. The flags were taken down, the crowds dispersed, the athletes returned home. Only the debt remained. In the quiet after the games, the scale of the disaster began to surface. The final bill was not the promised $310 million. It was $1.6 billion, 5 times the original cost. And the city was broke. The stadium was unfinished. The retractable roof had failed before it was even installed. The tower, that great symbol of ambition, leaned over the skyline like a question mark. Contractors demanded payment. Unions went on strike. The provincial government blamed the mayor, and the mayor blamed everyone else. Jean Drapeau disappeared from the cameras for days at a time. When he finally returned, his voice had lost its brightness. "It was worth it," he said softly. The world saw Montreal. But the world also saw the bill. In the weeks that followed, investigators found a labyrinth of overbilling, mismanagement, and political interference. Steel that should have cost thousands had cost millions. Equipment was purchased twice. Contracts were handed to friends and loyalists without competition. The provincial auditor's report called it a monument to waste. Ordinary citizens were furious. Taxes climbed to cover the losses. New levies appeared on cigarettes, alcohol, and gasoline, all feeding a debt that seemed endless. Montrealers, once proud to host the games, began to curse them. The Olympic Stadium, once a promise of progress, now stood as a daily reminder of failure. Its empty seats filled only by pigeons and regret. Rain leaked through unfinished concrete. The roof, when finally built years later, tore again and again until it had to be dismantled completely. What had begun as a monument to the future became a mausoleum for a dream. By 1977, the numbers were so large they barely made sense. Each month the city owed more. Interest grew faster than payment. Entire generations would be born, grow old, and die before the debt would be cleared. Economists warned that Montreal's finances would never recover. The city's credit rating collapsed. Businesses fled to Toronto. The Olympic Games had not only bankrupted Montreal, they had shifted the balance of Canada itself. The story of Montreal 1976 became a warning whispered in every Olympic Committee meeting after it. Cities that once fought to host the Games now hesitated. The myth of Olympic glory had cracked. In Canada it was more than economics. It was humiliation. The world had come, seen the spectacle, and left behind a crater of debt. But beneath the anger and the politics, something deeper stirred, the quiet pain of the workers who had built it. Men who had poured concrete through freezing nights, believing in a vision that betrayed them. Families who had watched their taxes rise while officials dined at banquets. Mothers who told their children, "You'll still be paying for this when I'm gone." They were right. It would take 30 years for the debt to die. 30 years to erase the numbers written in the name of pride. Yet even then not everything was lost. In the midst of ruin, beauty had bloomed. The games themselves had moments that no money could measure. Comaneci's perfect tens, Bruce Jenner's decathlon triumph, the unity of nations during a fragile Cold War peace. For 2 weeks, humanity had glimpsed perfection. And maybe, just maybe, that glimpse was worth the price. Or at least that's what those who believed in dreams still said. Years passed. The stadium decayed. Political careers ended, scandals cooled, and memories faded. But the debt remained, like a ghost chained to the city's heart. Every citizen carried a piece of it, in their taxes, in their cynicism, in their sighs when they passed the looming tower. The Olympic dream had become a cautionary tale. In the 1980s, efforts were made to revive the stadium. It hosted baseball, football, concerts, anything that might justify its cost. But maintenance swallowed every dollar it earned. Repairs, accidents, lawsuits, it was endless. Locals joked that it was the only place in Canada where it rains indoors. The nickname stuck. By the 1990s, Montreal's skyline had changed. The Olympic Stadium stood like an artifact from another age, colossal, beautiful, and broken. It had become a monument not to victory, but to the dangers of ambition without restraint. The debt, however, still lived on paper, creeping through the decades like ivy through stone. Not until 2006, 30 long years after the Games, did Montreal finally make the last payment. When the announcement came, it wasn't with fireworks or cheers. It was a quiet press release. A line in the newspaper. A sigh of relief 3 decades late. But numbers can't measure everything. The real cost of Montreal 1976 was not written in dollars. It was written in trust, in pride, in the way a nation saw itself. For Canada, the Olympics had been a chance to show strength. Instead, it revealed vulnerability, the limits of optimism and the price of dreams too grand to afford. And yet, perhaps that's what makes Montreal 1976 unforgettable. Not its failure, but its humanity. The stubborn belief that something beautiful could rise, no matter the cost. The same spirit that builds cathedrals and conquers mountains. The same flaw, and the same glory, that defines every great endeavor. The stadium still stands today. Its concrete bones have outlived the men who built it. Tourists visit not for what it represents but for what it teaches. That even the brightest dreams cast long shadows. By the dawn of the 1980s, the stadium on Penouf Boulevard had already become a symbol. From the freeway, it looked magnificent, that slanted tower against the gray Montreal sky, its concrete shell gleaming after rain. But inside, the echo of emptiness was deafening. Wind whistled through corridors built for glory and now haunted by silence. Every month the bills arrived. Interest on loans taken to finish the Games. Fees for maintenance, for insurance, for keeping the lights on in a place that had already gone dark. Each payment felt like throwing coins into an endless pit. People started joking about it in cafes. The Olympics are over, but they still run every month, straight through our wallets. Humor was a shield. Behind the laughter, frustration hardened into fatigue. For some Montrealers, the stadium was not a monument, it was a wound. Yet life went on. Children who had been too young to remember the Games grew up hearing the story as legend. The beautiful disaster, the big O, the folly of a mayor who promised perfection. At school, teachers spoke of it not as history but as warning. And outside the classrooms, the tower kept leaning. In winter, snow piled on the roof until it cracked. In spring, rain poured through seams and seams were patched again. Every repair spawned another cost. Every fix demanded another loan. By mid-decade, Montreal's city budget devoted a full tenth of its revenue to Olympic debt service. Roads crumbled. Public transport aged. Young families moved west to Toronto, to Calgary, anywhere that didn't carry the same burden. Montreal had once dreamed of leading the country. Now it was learning to survive it. The 1980s were cruel to the Olympic legacy itself. Television brought stories of boycotts, doping, corruption. Cities everywhere were calculating whether they could afford the Games at all. When Los Angeles hosted in 1984 and actually made money, commentators whispered. They learned from Montreal. But the lesson in Montreal was harsher. It wasn't just about budgets. It was about pride, how it blinds, how it binds, how it endures long after the applause ends. In the neighborhoods surrounding the stadium, daily life shrank. Shops closed. Houses fell into neglect. People said the area had caught the same sickness as the structure itself. A slow wasting, a gray fatigue. But even there, small acts of resilience appeared. Community leagues played in the shadow of the tower. Street artists painted the concrete walls with color and hope. The stadium had failed as a temple, but it could still be a gathering place. When Jean Drapeau left office in 1986, he carried with him both admiration and resentment. For many, he remained the man who gave Montreal its moment on the world stage. For others, he was the author of the city's longest debt. In interviews near the end of his life, he said quietly, "The Olympics were a dream. Dreams are expensive." He died still believing it had been worth it. The debt, however, had no sentiment. By 1990, it stood at more than $1 billion including interest. The provincial government stepped in again, issuing new bonds to restructure payments. Economists joked that the Games had become a pension plan for banks. Every year, the province mailed out new statements showing how little had changed. Numbers dwindled slowly, almost imperceptibly, like ice melting in shade. But Montreal learned patience. The same stubbornness that once built the stadium now paid for it month after month. Citizens grumbled, but they paid. It became a ritual, unwanted, unavoidable, uniquely theirs. Time softened the anger. The 1990s brought music festivals, baseball games, and brief summers of optimism. The Montreal Expos filled the stands for a while, the crack of bats echoing where the cheers of 1976 had once been. Children who had never seen an Olympic race called the place simply the stadium, not the debt. History was fading, replaced by the rhythm of daily life. Then one by one those lights went out too. The Expos left. The roof tore again. The tower leaked. Rain fell through the same gaps workers had sealed decades before. People joked that the only thing eternal about Montreal's Olympics was maintenance. Yet even as the building decayed, the city changed around it. New immigrants brought new languages, new dreams. Cafés filled the streets again. Young artists began photographing the stadium not as failure, but as poetry, a relic of impossible ambition. To them it wasn't shame. It was character. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Montreal's relationship with its ghost began to heal. Debt was becoming memory. Memory was becoming story. In 2006, when the final payment was made, there was no parade. Just a brief statement from Quebec's finance minister. The Olympic debt has been retired. 30 years. 3 generations. $1.5 billion. One lesson that would echo through every Olympic bid thereafter. Montrealers woke up the next morning, looked at the same gray tower and smiled. Not in triumph, not in regret, in recognition. They had paid for their dream in full. And perhaps, after all that time, that made it theirs again. The world had moved on, but the Olympics had changed because of Montreal. Budgets were now scrutinized. Contracts were regulated. Every host city studied 1976 as a warning etched in stone. Never promise what you cannot build. Even so, human nature never learns completely. New cities still chase the glow of glory, still gamble on the grand gesture. Because to build is to believe. And belief is always expensive. By the time the tower's observation deck reopened to tourists, the stadium had become almost beloved again, a relic turned landmark, a scar turned symbol. School children visited to learn about courage and miscalculation, ambition and endurance. Photographers captured the light pouring through its ribs at sunset and called it beautiful. Maybe it always had been. The games that bankrupted a nation had also built something intangible: humility, identity, story. Montreal carried those like metals no one could melt. Time has a way of sanding the edges off catastrophe. It takes what was unbearable and turns it into myth. By the 21st century, the story of Montreal 1976 had shifted from anger to parable. Visitors who stepped out of the metro and looked up at the stadium's tower no longer saw ruin. They saw endurance, the strange, stubborn beauty of a city that refused to vanish beneath its mistakes. The structure had become part of Montreal's silhouette, as inseparable from the skyline as the river or the mountain. Inside, echoes still lived. The same corridors where workers once cursed the delays now carried the laughter of schoolchildren on field trips. Tour guides spoke of architecture and vision. They rarely mentioned debt. But in quiet corners you could still feel it, the weight of dreams too heavy for their foundations. When future Olympic host cities drafted their plans, they all invoked Montreal's name. Some as warning, some as excuse. Every cost estimate, every feasibility report carried the ghost of the Big O. And yet, despite everything, cities still competed for the right to host. Athens, Beijing, London. They built their own stadiums of glass and steel, convinced that they could balance ambition with prudence. Some succeeded. Many didn't. Each time, journalists would resurrect Montreal's numbers, comparing, calculating, reminding. The lesson was simple and impossible. The games are never just about sport. They are about nations dreaming out loud, and paying for the echo. For Canada, the scars had faded, but the pride remained. Montreal had paid its debt, dollar by dollar, and in doing so had earned something priceless: perspective. The country learned that grandeur and humility can coexist. That beauty can rise from failure if one is patient enough to wait for it. In the years that followed, the stadium found new lives. Concerts, festivals, winter fairs. Each event added another layer of memory, softening the old wound. People joked less, smiled more. Some even called it our concrete cathedral. It still leaked, but it belonged to them again. The legacy of the games extended beyond finances. For architects, the stadium became a study in daring design. For economists, a case in fiscal caution. For poets, it was a metaphor for the human condition. How we build the impossible knowing it may break us and build it anyway. The Olympics themselves changed too. The committee began demanding transparency, sustainability, long-term use. They spoke of legacy, of public benefit, words that had barely existed in 1976. Every reform carried a trace of Montreal's experience, proof that even failure can be fertile. In 2016, 40 years after the flame had burned, an anniversary exhibition opened inside the stadium. Photographs lined the halls, black and white images of workers in hard hats, of drapeaus smiling at blueprints, of Nadia Comaneci mid-flight. Visitors walked slowly, some in awe, some in quiet sadness. At the center stood a single plaque. Here a city dreamed too big, and in dreaming discovered who it was. People stopped to read it. Some nodded. A few cried. Outside, evening light poured through the tower's tilted frame. The concrete glowed gold as if the building itself had forgiven the world. Montreal had once reached for the heavens and fallen into debt. Now it stood, steady and still, a reminder that falling isn't the same as failing. You only fail when you refuse to learn. And Montreal had learned, painfully, completely, beautifully. The citizens who once cursed the Olympics now told their children the story with a kind of affection. They spoke of ambition, of mistakes, of resilience. They said it with pride because the debt had been paid not just with money, but with endurance. The stadium, once mocked as the Big O, had become the Big Overcome. If you walk there today, you can hear the city breathing again. Trains rumble below, pigeons circle the tower, the air smells faintly of rain and steel. The past is still there, folded into the cracks, humming quietly beneath the concrete. But so is the future. The games that bankrupted a nation gave birth to a stronger one. A nation that knows what it costs to dream, and dares to dream anyway. Because every flame, no matter how it begins, leaves light behind. And sometimes that light is worth every shadow it casts. Every generation inherits the echoes of the one before it. For Montreal, those echoes came not in the sound of applause, but in the quiet hum of payment machines, in the signatures at the bottom of tax forms, in the slow rebuilding of faith. For years, the Olympic Stadium stood half-loved, half-resented. It was a monument without celebration, a cathedral of what-ifs. Yet with each passing decade, the story changed shape, as stories do when they are told by those who survived them. What began as a cautionary tale was turning into a parable of endurance. In the cafés of the plateau, old men who had once cursed Mayor Drapeau now spoke of him with reluctant admiration. He was mad, they would say, but he made us look at ourselves. They remembered the light in the city during those 2 weeks of 1976. The parades, the crowds, the feeling that the world had come to see them. For a moment, Montreal had been the center of the earth. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth something after all. Children born long after the games grew up visiting the stadium as a curiosity, a place for school trips, concerts, baseball games, science fairs. They saw it not as a scar but as part of the city's skin. To them, its strange tilted tower and its stubborn bulk weren't symbols of failure. They were just Montreal, proud, imperfect, alive. In time, the city stopped apologizing for it. What had once been a mistake became an identity. Architects from around the world came to study its curves, its flaws, its defiant beauty. Students of design called it brutalist poetry. They said it captured something eternal about the human urge to reach higher than reason allows. One of them wrote in a notebook, "It looks like it's still trying to finish itself." And maybe it was. By the 2010s, global headlines about Olympic overruns, Athens, Rio, Sochi, returned Montreal's name to the news. This time it wasn't mockery. It was precedent. The city that had once been a warning had become wisdom. When Tokyo planned its games, when Los Angeles drew its budgets, Montreal was the ghost at every meeting table. Its story whispered from the past, "Be careful or you'll build what you can't afford to love." But there was another whisper too, softer, almost hopeful. Dare anyway. Because in the end, all progress begins as risk. Every bridge, every rocket, every piece of art was once someone's folly. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, that was what Drapeau understood. He had not built the stadium for himself. He had built it because he believed that beauty could outlast embarrassment. Standing before the tower today, it's hard not to feel that he was right in some small tragic way. The city changed. The debt faded. But the tower still reaches upward, against logic, against time. And when the evening light hits it just right, it looks like a frozen flame. Inside there are exhibitions now, panels describing how steel warped in winter, how workers struck, how the budget ballooned. There are photos of the opening ceremony, the flags, the smiles, the fireworks. No one hides the contradictions anymore. The disaster has become heritage. One plaque reads, "Perfection is not built in a day. Sometimes it is not built at all. But still we try." People stop to take pictures of that one. Montreal learned what all dreamers learn, that creation and ruin are twins. Every masterpiece flirts with failure. Every vision demands a price. And though the city paid more than it ever expected, it emerged richer in a way that no ledger could record. Because in the long arc of history, even mistakes can shine. Today, when the lights of the stadium come on for a concert or a soccer match, there is a hush, a heartbeat. The building breathes again, not as a burden but as memory, proof that a city once dared too much and survived it. For a moment, under that vast dome, you can almost hear the crowd of 1976, roaring for a future they couldn't yet see. And maybe that's what remains after all debts are paid, the sound of believing still echoing in the concrete. Montreal's story is not a story of failure. It's a story of human proportion, of how far we'll go to touch something eternal, and how we find grace when we fall short. The stadium still stands. The dream still breathes. And the city, older and wiser, carries both with pride. Because the games that bankrupted a nation built something far greater than wealth. They built a memory that refuses to die. There is a silence that lives in great structures when the crowds are gone. It is not emptiness. It is memory. The Olympic Stadium of Montreal holds that kind of silence. A silence heavy with the weight of voices, with the ghost of applause, with the hum of ambition that once filled its concrete lungs. If you stand in the center of the field and close your eyes, you can still feel it. The echo of the drums from the opening ceremony. The rhythm of footsteps from athletes long gone. The whisper of rain slipping through cracks in the roof, the old, stubborn roof that never quite behaved. It feels alive not because of perfection but because of persistence. For the people who lived through 1976, the story never really ended. It grew quieter, yes, but it remained, in the conversations of parents warning their children about promises too grand, in the lectures of economists using it as case study, in the knowing look between builders who remembered the long, cold nights. And yet, when those same people passed the stadium years later, many of them smiled. Time had turned bitterness into nostalgia. They had paid for the dream, and by paying they had earned the right to love it again. Montreal had become something unique, a city that survived its own miracle. There is a strange grace in imperfection. Perhaps that is why, decades later, people still come to see the stadium. Not because it succeeded, but because it didn't, not entirely. It stands as proof that failure does not erase beauty. It only makes it human. Artists painted at sunrise, the tower glowing gold against the mist. Photographers wait for the exact moment when light slips between the ribs of concrete. In those moments, the building doesn't look broken. It looks eternal. The very flaw that once shamed Montreal has become its soul. In classrooms across Canada, teachers tell the story as lesson and inspiration. They say, "Dream big but learn from those who dream too big." Then they add quietly, "And if you fall, fall beautifully." Children listen, eyes wide, imagining the fireworks of 1976, the triumphs of athletes, the drama of construction, the pride of a city that dared. They learn that history is not just about victory, it's about endurance. And that sometimes, the price of greatness is living with its consequences. When the debt was finally gone, the papers called it a closure. But it wasn't. Nothing truly ends when it becomes part of who you are. Montreal didn't erase its Olympic past. It absorbed it. The city learned to breathe with its scars, to wear them not as shame but as signature. In that, perhaps, lies the truest form of redemption. The games that bankrupted a nation left behind more than bills and headlines. They left a philosophy, that progress is not measured by perfection but by resilience. That beauty can outlast ruin. That sometimes you build not because you can afford to, but because you cannot bear not to try. That is why Montreal's story still matters. It's not about money or politics or even sport. It's about the audacity to believe, and the courage to live with the cost of belief. In a quiet evening, when the lights of the tower flicker on one by one, you can see the reflection in the windows of nearby buildings. A single white shape, leaning into the sky. It looks less like a tower now and more like a hand reaching upward. And in a way, that's what it has always been. A hand. A reach. A reminder. Because no city, no nation, no human being ever achieves greatness without risk. And risk, by its nature, carries loss. To dream is to gamble with the future, to wager comfort for wonder. Montreal lost the gamble in 1976. But in the long run, it gained something that no success could have given it: humility, endurance, and the quiet dignity of having dared. If there's a lesson in those cold years of debt and doubt, it is this. We build not to be perfect, but to be remembered. We dream not to win, but to see how far hope can take us before it breaks. And sometimes, even when the dream collapses under its own weight, the act of dreaming leaves light behind. Light that guides others, light that defines a generation. Montreal's Olympic Stadium still stands because the human spirit insists on standing. Its cracks are real, its cost unforgiven, but its presence undeniable. It's a monument to ambition, yes, but also to survival. A place where glory and ruin live side by side, as they do in every human heart. Years from now, when new cities rise and new games unfold, when new leaders make the same promises, the wind will still move through those concrete corridors in Montreal. And perhaps, if one listens closely, it will carry a voice, not of warning, not of regret, but of truth. A voice saying, "We dreamed, we failed, we learned, and still we stand." That is the real legacy of 1976. Not the debt, not the disaster, but the light that remains. History, like architecture, has layers. And beneath the concrete layers of Montreal's Olympic Stadium lies something deeper than numbers. A story about what it means to reach beyond reason and to live with the consequences. In the end, Montreal's debt was not a tragedy, it was a revelation. It revealed the true cost of glory, not measured in dollars but in decades of reckoning. Every city that followed learned from it, every generation of planners and dreamers traced its silhouette and whispered, "Let's not make the same mistake." And yet they always do. Because humanity forgets what comfort teaches, and remembers only what wonder demands. In Athens, in Beijing, in Rio, the pattern repeated. Promises, budgets, blueprints, applause. And always afterward the bill. The lesson of Montreal echoed through time. The Olympics are not about winning races. They are about the lengths to which nations will go to be seen. For 16 days, a country can hold the world's gaze. For 16 days, flags flutter like heartbeats. And when it ends, the silence that follows is the true cost of glory. Montreal understood that silence. It lived it, paid for it, carried it. But it also outlasted it. That may be its greatest victory, that after all the noise, after all the blame, the city endured. Other host cities lost their stadiums to rust and weeds. Montreal kept its tower standing, cracked and proud, like a scar that refused to fade. It is the proof that ruin can be beautiful, that failure can age into something almost sacred. There's a photograph taken in 1976, just after the closing ceremony. The stadium lights are off. The track is empty. In the center, one worker sweeps confetti into a pile. Around him stretch the stands, enormous, silent, and still. That image captures everything. The end of spectacle. The beginning of death. The quiet reality beneath every moment of triumph. And yet, look closer. The man is smiling. Maybe because he knows what the cameras never show, that after the fireworks someone always has to clean up, and that there's grace even in that. As decades passed, the stadium's reputation transformed from disgrace to endurance. It became a mirror for the city's own evolution, from arrogance to humility, from shame to pride. Every crack became a reminder that time and honesty can make peace with even the worst of mistakes. No one calls Montreal naive anymore. They call it brave. Because bravery isn't in never falling. It's in rising when you do. When the lights of the tower shine against the night sky now, they no longer illuminate death. They illuminate memory. A city's collective heart, pulsing through decades of doubt, finally steady. People walk beneath it hand in hand, unaware or maybe unconcerned with what it once cost. It's just there, like the mountain, like the river, part of the city's pulse. And maybe that's the truest form of redemption, when what once symbolized failure becomes invisible, not because it's forgotten, but because it's forgiven. Montreal will never host another Olympics. It doesn't need to. Its name is already carved into Olympic history, not for records or medals but for the truth it revealed. That glory, when stripped of illusion, is heavy. And yet, even when it breaks us, we keep chasing it. Because we are built that way. Because the human heart doesn't count cost when it's dreaming. Standing today at the edge of the field, where Nadia Comaneci once landed her perfect 10, where Drapeau once stood before flashing cameras, where a nation once held its breath, you can feel both pride and sorrow mingling in the air. The past is not gone, it hums beneath your feet. The same ground that once symbolized failure now speaks of endurance. The same concrete that once held debt now holds history. And the same tower that once leaned under the weight of ridicule now leans only toward the sky. Montreal didn't build perfection. It built proof. Proof that dreams can bankrupt a city, and still somehow enrich its soul. If one day the stadium falls, as all things eventually do, it will not be remembered as the project that ruined a city. It will be remembered as the monument that taught the world what dreams are truly worth. Not in money, not in time, but in courage. Because even when the numbers fade, even when the concrete cracks and the stories turn to dust, one truth will remain. That there was once a city in the north that looked at the world and said, "We can do this." And though it nearly broke them, they did. The last light of the day falls slow over Montreal. It spills down the sides of the Olympic Tower, turning gray concrete gold. From the street, the structure looks eternal, but up close you can see the scars. The hairline fractures, the seams where the roof was mended again and again. Every scar is a sentence in the city's long confession. We dreamed too hard, we paid too much, and we lived to tell it. The plaza is almost empty now. A few children run across the wide open space, their laughter bouncing off the stone. They don't know the numbers, the interest rates, the speeches. They only know that the tower points upward and that it's theirs. In their eyes it's not a mistake. It's a landmark. Somewhere inside, an old janitor switches off the last row of lights and locks the doors. He's worked here for 40 years, long enough to remember when the roof first leaked, when the Expos played, when the debt finally died. He doesn't think of it as failure. He thinks of it as home. The story of Montreal 1976 is more than history now. It has become part of the city's language. Taxi drivers mention it to tourists, Professors lecture about it, artists sketch it, singers write about it. It lives not in shame, but in rhythm, the same rhythm that runs through every human effort that goes too far and somehow survives. It's easy to call it a disaster. Harder to see what it gave back. Because even in ruin, Montreal never stopped believing that something beautiful could come from trying. And maybe that belief, foolish, stubborn, necessary, is the thing that keeps cities alive. The Olympics moved on. They went to Moscow, Los Angeles, Seoul, Sydney, London. Each time, cities promised efficiency, legacy, control. Each time, they discovered the same truth Montreal had written in concrete. That greatness never comes cheap, and that the only guarantee of glory is its price. But Montreal also left a quieter inheritance, a model for endurance. When other stadiums were abandoned, Montreal still stood. When cynicism turned other cities inward, Montreal kept looking outward. It had already paid in full for its lesson, and in paying, found freedom. Now, when evening falls and the lights flicker on across the city, you can see the tower in the distance, leaning toward the night sky like an unfinished thought. The stars gather above it, small, bright, countless. And for a second you can almost believe that the dream never really ended. It just grew quieter, deeper, older. The games that bankrupted a nation did not destroy Montreal. They revealed it, proud, flawed, human, beautiful. They stripped away the illusion of perfection and left something truer behind. A city that knows exactly what it costs to hope. There is a line carved in stone near the entrance now. Most people pass it without reading, but those who stop see the words. We built more than we could afford. But we built it anyway. And that is the essence of being human. To build what we can't afford. To dream what we can't control. To rise even when the fall is certain. That's what Montreal did in 1976. That's what every generation does in its own way. Reach upward, fail gloriously, and keep reaching. The wind moves through the empty stands. Dust settles on the old track. Somewhere, far above, a single light flickers inside the tower, reflected in the glass like a flame that refuses to go out. It's not the Olympic flame. It's something older, smaller, more honest. The light that remains when the spectacle ends. The light of endurance. The light of memory. The light of a dream that, though broken, still burns. And so, when history remembers Montreal 1976, let it remember not the numbers, not the debt, not the speeches. Let it remember the courage of a city that dared to imagine itself larger than its limits, and found beauty in the ruins. Because in the end, that is all glory ever is. The brief, brilliant moment when we touch the impossible. And the long, quiet years we spend learning to live with it. The camera would fade out on the tower, the sky behind it turning to dusk. The city breathes. The world turns. And in the fading light, one truth remains, clear as the sound of a single heartbeat echoing through empty seats. We built. We paid. We endured. And we remain. The games that bankrupted a nation. The city that outlived them. Montreal, 1976.